The battles for Avdiivka became famous for the columns of tanks exploding in the fields. The armored vehicles with twisted metal were in the newspaper headlines. On the internet, images with bodies of Ukrainians and Russians spread like a morbid virus that infected the eyes of the curious. The price of war was high for all that equipment. The anti-tank missiles broke through the hard shell of the metal monsters many times in Avdiivka and around. Other parts were also torn apart in much more intimate and lethal confrontations in the trenches. The skins of Russians and Ukrainians were broken many times by ammunition of different calibers, in battles where a man needed to have cold blood to see the enemy face to face, seeing the terror shine in a person's eyes, and often the glow of life go out in the midst of the smoke raised by the grenades. He experienced war in Iraq and Afghanistan, fighting under the flag of the United States. After that, he never abandoned the rifle, being part of teams, including fighting on the side of the Kurds, both in Syria and in Iraq. The sound of ammunition firing and of languages other than English became more frequent than conversations with family in the state of Iowa. He enlisted early for work in Ukraine, along with other English-speaking veterans who formed the Chosen Company, acting under the command of the 59th Brigade of Ukraine. He had to adapt to a conflict unlike anything he had seen before. Russians and Ukrainians had many issues to resolve at a time when the world was writhing in conflicts or in threats of war. The resources spent on the battles in Zaporizhia, Donetsk, or Luhansk were absurd up until 2023, affecting the entire country of Ukraine and also having influences in Russia, where little of the wave of war fury had gone. The estimate was of more than 9,000 civilians killed during the Russian attacks, mainly the bombings in the cities. Children were among the victims within the calculations accounted for by the United Nations. More than 17 million people had to move, generating even more than 4 million refugees throughout Europe. Some sources revealed that more than 500,000 soldiers had been injured or killed in the conflict. The lives lost, the fragmented bodies, and the minds forever wounded by war were irreparable losses. However, both countries had their secrets about these losses. Russia, for example, claimed that in just 2 years about 5,000 of their soldiers had died on one of the fiercest battlefields on the planet. Obviously, in the information war, one side accused the other of astronomical losses in rumors that were taken seriously only by the most uninformed or by those who childishly cheered as if the war were a game. Ryan O'Leary saw many friends perish in Ukraine. Fortunately, in Chosen Company, he still had some fighting by his side, like Dalton Medley, another veteran who had adopted the War Gimlin name in reference to one of the dwarves from The Lord of the Rings by John Ronald Reuel Tolkien. The two remembered the drone attack that blew up one of their temporary bases, taking the lives of some soldiers. Russia doubled its defense budget in 2023 with an expenditure expectation of over $100 billion. The estimate was that the country would be spending over $63 billion per year just on the conflict, making the Ukraine war up to that point the fourth largest war expenditure in history. Ukraine alone would never be able to withstand this military and economic power. Even though it did not have the support of regular armies or all the equipment from the West, it received in the 2 years of battle over $100 billion in support, including equipment and other types of military aid. Ryan heard stories of million-dollar missiles flying on both sides and the news of destruction that came shortly after. He thought about the distortions, like how sometimes there was still difficulty for his company to receive some equipment, or everything was simply too slow. In fact, the way the Allies so slowly dispensed so many weapons only prolonged the war. Meanwhile, he and his men fought from trench to trench, noticing some important points. Ryan's years of fighting against the Islamic State alongside the Kurds were very different from what he was experiencing there. He also had problems with weapons. The geography was another enemy in itself. And the Islamic State was as lethal as it was frightening due to the promises of what they would do to their enemies. However, it was different from the battles where the threat of drones reigned, the terror of the trenches, the danger of Russian missile artillery landing on your head at any moment. And Ryan and Gimli soon found themselves in Avdiivka, which would become the great ambition of the Russians in the second half of 2023. Russia had been attacking constantly. They were less worried about the Ukrainian counteroffensive, knowing that little remained beyond a macabre battle in regions filled with mines and trenches that change hands every week. Their main target, which generated more news, was Avdiivka later that year. The city was crucial to strengthen their position over Donetsk. Taking such a fortified target would be a demonstration of power and also create a new defense that prevented any Ukrainian advance in the region. The problem was the resources and lives needed to achieve the feat. But Russia would keep trying. And there was more to this battle than just tanks burning on the snow. One of the indicators of the plans that the Russians would use were the news that former mercenaries from the Wagner group had joined the Battle of Avdiivka after the company had fallen from grace. The musicians would be serving under the National Guard of Russia. The Kremlin prepared one of its major offensives against Avdiivka. Among the Russian forces was the 1st Elyaviansk Motorized Rifle Brigade, the 8th Separate Sparta Intelligence Battalion, and the Somalia Battalion, belonging to the separatist groups of the Donetsk People's Republic. The 9th Marine Regiment demonstrated how seriously Russia took that battle. The 139th Tank Regiment was one of the heavy support groups for the advances. In addition to other important forces, such as the 114th Separate Motorized Rifle Brigade, there was a highlight for the Z Assault Units, or Storm Z Units, formed mainly by problematic soldiers and ex-prisoners with the promise of pardon if they survived the war. Much like what happened in Bakhmut when Wagner Group used similarly formed companies, it was likely that many of them would know freedom only in the hands of death, even if they achieved victory. And victory was what Russia yearned for at all costs, preparing to advance like a wave of fire and blood over Lyrica. The attacks on the Ukrainian trenches always began with heavy artillery. The first step was the Supercam S-350 drones being put in the air to correctly identify the Ukrainian hideouts. Each coordinate was carefully noted and the positions checked to be passed on to the artillery. The 152mm 2S5 howitzers hidden among the trees were loaded with death that was soon propelled towards the Ukrainian positions. The explosions happened in a sequence over the soldiers, finishing off the already battered landscape. Sometimes only kamikaze drones flying towards the enemy defense were needed. The deadly descent was controlled by the detachment of the 1st Special Forces of the Donetsk Army, known as Hawks. The drones were thrown one after the other into the trenches, undermining Ukrainian lives. Little by little, sometime later, the Russians took over. Of course, maintaining the position near Avdiivka was not easy. From the city came the Ukrainian mortars and howitzers bursting over the trenches to the point where it was necessary to rotate troops quickly to remove the wounded. The positions inside or around Avdiivka were under constant bombardment to prepare for a larger invasion. The Russians had advanced in their Soviet bombs, transforming their free air bomb 500s. The 500 kilograms of explosives were satellite-guided after being fired by Su-34 or Su-35. The bombs crumbled the buildings with ease. One of the most impressive Russian attacks occurred south of Avdiivka, in Skotovata. The Ukrainian fortifications were hard to take, which led to an idea. The soldiers dug a tunnel, carefully measuring each meter until they reached the right point to place the explosives. The strategy surprised the Ukrainians with an explosion that blew up the soldiers and influenced the surviving defenders. The Russian infantry swiftly charged through the destroyed scene based on the aggressive dispensation of grenades and ammunition from the AK-74 Unions. The Ukrainians even responded back with their own explosions, trying to contain the Russian advance. The morale, already low due to the initial attack, was further eroded with kamikaze drones diving on the defenders. The troops began to retreat, as they knew that the Russian advance had taken too strong a momentum to be stopped. The problem was for the soldiers cornered inside bunkers by Russian squads. The AK-74Ms bellowed death threats into the hideouts. The grenades flew shortly after, thrown by the support man with the PKM machine gun in hand. This last weapon fired incessantly amidst the smoke, carving a path through the air tainted by violence. The PKM's ammunition seemed infinite, 600 shots per minute breaking the defenses and lives within the bunker. The fire consumed the land and Ukrainian flesh. The survivors tried to escape, running into the forest. However, the Russian artillery still managed to embrace some of these soldiers. The Ukrainians even tried to counterattack and take positions a few times, leading their men over the armored vehicles. In Vodiano, south of Avdiivka, the battles remained strong as the location was essential for the Russians to complete their circus plans. The Ukrainian tank tried to break the defenses, while the infantry fighting vehicle also arrived, firing and releasing the soldiers for the assault. However, the Russian shots were accurate against the armored attack vehicle. The tank was hit with such precision that it became unusable. The newly released soldiers had to retreat to avoid being torn apart by the subsequent Russian attacks. The surviving crew of the tank also ran in hopes of retreating with the infantry fighting vehicle. The Russians continued their slow advances towards Vinica, but the Ukrainians would not make it easy for them. The 59 Brigade was prepared to fight for their positions. Ryan and Gimli were fighting for the chosen company until September of 2023. The orders given by the 59 were to stop the Russians' advance through the flanks, retaking some positions as soon as possible. This was not an easy job and required a kind of skill that Gimli and Ryan's years in the American Armed Forces had not helped much. Close quarters battle training was important there, but invading a house was very different from fighting in a trench. Ryan complained that part of the NATO training was not what the Ukrainians really needed. Perhaps the United States still had a lot to learn from the Ukrainians. The equipment was extremely important, but nowhere near enough to stop an army like the Russian one. Trained and motivated soldiers were the key piece to control this equipment, invade a trench, or withstand the bombing in a position. Russia was an undeniable force of war. Their tanks advanced like leviathans on the battlefield, breaking through defenses and with their cannons aimed in search of victims. It took a motivated soldier to wait in the right position, knowing that enemy drones and artillery could locate him. This soldier then prepared his anti-tank guided missile, hoping that the anti-tank missile would take effect before the armored vehicles reached a position to fire. Anti-tank teams equipped with the Stagnapi could hit an armored vehicle up to 5 kilometers away, but they needed to be well positioned, either inside buildings or along tree lines. The shot already made could give away the position, so they had to hope that the target would be disabled before they suffered from the artillery. The FGM-148 javelins were another very important weapon in the war, one that made the use of tanks be questioned once again. Such was the degree of destruction it caused in the Russian columns. Each missile cost $240,000, but it paid off when they destroyed million-dollar tanks and would end up destroying equipment and killing soldiers. The Russian column confidently advanced against the positions of the 59th, not counting on the Javelin team. That day, the entrenched men were on the other side of the field waiting for the enemy assault. The sight locked onto the tank and released a 16 Ks missile. The guided projectile burst through the armor, leaving only a monster moving in agony in its final moments on the battlefield. One of the tanks hit in one of the battles burned for a long time, worrying the soldiers that it could still fulfill its attack objective. However, despite all the power, the Russian armored vehicle had a flaw. The Russians wanted quick shots and a smaller crew in the tank, so they chose to have its ammunition storage in a carousel shape in the body of the tank immediately below the turret. It was from there that the self-ammunition came, and also the big explosions that usually cost the life of a hard-trained crew. Ryan, O'Leary, and Gimli observed the use of these equipments, but their day-to-day was in the trench. Of course, in all cases it was necessary for the Ukrainians to soften up the Russians with artillery and drones before they could make the assault. The transport took the chosen company through difficult terrain until they reached the Russian positions. The 1,320 grenade launcher was reloaded and fired in the midst of the convulsions. The grenades headed without precision, with the only hope of suppressing the Russians while the soldiers approached. The columns of smoke rose along with the war cries of the soldiers. The enemies returned fire as best they could, having large targets right in front of them. Of course, there was always the risk of someone getting hit. Everyone disembarked, using speed and violence as a basis, part of the American teaching for close quarters combat. Being fast was necessary to escape from the fingers of death, calling for a more intimate encounter. The team leaders threw the men forward. Let us go, get the fuck in the RE. No one could stop the advance. They crouched down in front of the trench, throwing grenades to clear the way. They entered the holes, breaking through the smoke. The panting breath pulled the black air with the scent of gunpowder into their lungs, intoxicating the men with the violence of the trench. They fired into the holes, seeing enemies or not, making their way over the warnings that fragmentation grenades would fly. A man only turned a corner after the bang of the explosives signaled that the passage was clear and that death's invitation was made to another face. The smell of earth mixed with the scent of gunpowder, letting death dance in the middle of the chaos ball. Ryan managed to flank the Russians, reaching the enemy's rear to the point of making the battlefield even more chaotic. In the midst of this death danced in circles over the men. The 5 Russians in that direction didn't realize who was shooting. 2 of them tried to flee desperately. They dropped their weapons and jumped over the broken trunks and remains of trees. Ryan handed over another partner for death to dance that day. The rifle hit one squarely, but the other, who escaped the shots, only saw his friend's body on the ground and continued his way. He realized too late that he was in front of the enemy. The terror on that face made Ryan hesitate. Without shooting, even in a dangerous situation where the nearby face could draw any weapon and eliminate him. But fear was an expression too delicious and seductive for death that in the midst of so much chaos ended up taking a Russian to an eternal dance. Without Ryan understanding how that had happened, a grenade exploded in front of the American, but he remained in the same position, firing with the rifle where 3 more Russians were still. Ryan's ammunition was not wasted. One of his opponents stopped moving among the living to become another guest at the dance of souls. The deceased's partner changed position to find another to help protect himself. He was preparing another grenade when he received a gift before he could send his own. Ryan's throw was accurate, sending dirt, blood, and bones to the target. The trenches had to be invaded in sequence. Sometimes they were part of a network where the soldiers saw groups of Russians defending each part in a system that made the assault even more difficult. The position of each region had to be careful when there was no longer an armored vehicle protecting the men with its steel or suppression fire. The front soldier inspired unparalleled courage to stand out from his companions and progressed rapidly towards the enemy trench. A grenade flew over him, bursting near one of the suffering trees. His partner came behind, throwing an explosive that fell precisely in the hole in front of the first soldier. The two realized that the Russians were further ahead in the trench, trying to suppress with inaccurate shots. After the opponent on the right was fatally hit, the first Ukrainian moved forward to position himself where he would have a clearer view of the enemies. The exchange of gunfire between the two tore up the earth from the trench, risking putting dust in the eyes of men who could not afford to miss for even a second. The Ukrainians finally entered the trench when the Russians couldn't withstand the suppression and ducked down, giving room for the enemies to take position at the corners. They pulled out the grenades for the final blow. Ryan, Gimli, the chosen company, and so many Ukrainians from the 59 Brigade thus finished the trenches, throwing the grenades into the bunkers to shatter the men who had not surrendered. A trench didn't have time for much conversation. Those who did not respond to the voice of the men said good morning to the face of death when an explosion broke their skin and blood vessels. The work of the Americans continued for a long time still. Gimli was part of a reconnaissance group seeking information about the Russians with a team with drones. They found positions in the houses around Avdiivka, but the soldier who dispenses death to others has his name registered in her memory. Thus, when the Russians realized where the reconnaissance group was, they initiated an attack. The first drone descended to break the roof of the house, throwing the debris on the men. Stunned, they began to count the living when the second kamikaze came stuffed with thermobaric ammunition. Leon was injured and died due to the fragments in his body at the end of September 2023. Ryan was forced to issue yet another news of one of his comrades killed in combat. The war demanded various prices from a soldier's soul. Sometimes it was the aggressive cut in the flesh, the loss of a limb, or the scars that were forever marked on the skin. In other cases, they were wounds that did not show, or a simple pain of telling someone's relatives that another body lay on the soil of Ukraine.